Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the American Federation of Teachers and Share My Lesson, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar on research-based strategies for teaching students with learning and attention issues. My name is Tamika Childs, and I am an AFT e-learning coordinator. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter, Bob Cunningham, with Understood for Educators. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome.
Hi, everyone. Like Tamika said, I'd like to welcome you to this presentation this evening. Thanks for giving up part of your day to be here with us. I'm going to do my best to give you some good, solid information on research-based strategies for teaching kids with learning and attention issues. Like Tamika said, my name is Bob Cunningham. I'm with Understood.org, and Understood.org is an organization devoted to helping people with learning and attention issues thrive. We have a few different programs. Our biggest is our parent program, and if you go to www.understood.org, you can find our site, which contains thousands of information pieces, tools, and tips and strategies that you can use. The site is designed for parents, but we've now started to include educator content on the parent site as well until we have our educator site up and running. So welcome to Understood. Welcome to this webinar, and hopefully you will learn a lot. I'm going to start with a very brief introduction of what are learning and attention issues, because it's a phrase that many of you probably aren't familiar with. It means sort of exactly what you think it would mean, kids who are struggling with learning and attention, in this case at school. We chose the phrase learning and attention issues because we did a lot of research with parents when we were launching Understood.org, and overwhelmingly the thousands of parents that we conducted research with chose the phrase learning and attention issues as the way they were comfortable having their kids described. That was out of things like learning disorder and specific learning disability and struggling learner and learning difference and all of those kind of terms that you hear. The parents told us that they preferred learning and attention issues, so that's what we went with. It also allows us to talk about kids who are identified for special education, diagnosed with specific conditions or disabilities, but also kids who are not yet diagnosed or identified. We know that 1 in 5 kids struggle with brain-based learning and attention issues that affect reading, writing, math, organization, and focus. So out of your classes, at least around 20% will have learning and attention issues. So this is not an uncommon problem. Learning and attention issues encompass both diagnosed and undiagnosed individuals, both identified and unidentified individuals. That's where that 20% stat comes from, the 1 in 5. And it includes things like learning disabilities and ADHD. When we talk about learning and attention issues, we do not include intellectual disability, autism spectrum disorder, physical or motor impairments, emotional disturbance or social emotional disorders, or the effects of trauma. Now, of course, we know, and hopefully you do too, that kids with kids with these conditions, intellectual disability or autism spectrum disorder or the effects of trauma, can also experience learning disabilities or ADHD, learning and attention issues broadly. We just know that if you have a child or a student who has an intellectual disability or a developmental disability or an autism spectrum disorder, something like that, we would love for you to start gathering information about those specific conditions and then come to Understood.org to find out more about the specific learning and attention issues that can go along with them. So that's why we do it that way. Just a note on language and kind of what this actually looks like. So if you think of these circles, all learners there in the purple is all the kids that you are working with. 1 in 5 of those kids has a learning or attention issue, and then a smaller number has actually been diagnosed with a specific learning disability or is eligible for special education as a child with a specific learning disability. So that's sort of how the vocabulary fits together. All learners, then a slightly smaller circle is the 1 in 5, and then a smaller circle than that is kids who are actually identified as having a specific LD for special education. Learning disabilities, just kind of a very brief overview. Learning disabilities are neurological disorders. They affect the brain's ability to receive, process, store, respond to, and communicate information. So it's all about how you perceive the world around you. It's the sense that your brain makes out of what you are hearing, seeing, touching, feeling, that sort of stuff. A learning disability, the term, is an umbrella term. It's not a single disorder. There are various kinds of learning disabilities that affect various aspects of learning. LDs are also spectrum disorders, which means that they range from mild to severe. So you can have a specific learning disability like dyslexia. You can have a milder form of that or a more severe form of that. We also know that co-occurrence amongst learning disabilities is very high. So if you have a learning disability in reading, you are more likely to have a learning disability in math as well than somebody without the learning disability in reading. It's also not uncommon for somebody to have both a learning disability and ADHD. In fact, we know that 1 in 3 individuals with learning disabilities also have ADHD. There are a lot of myths surrounding learning and attention issues, and these are important for us educators to know. We want to be familiar with the facts, and we also want to know what the myths are so that when they pop into our head or into our conversations with other people, we can recognize them as myths. When we surveyed for the State of Learning Disabilities report, which is published by the National Center for Learning Disabilities, also available online, when we took a look at the percentage of people who attribute learning disabilities to inaccurate causes, we found that up to 1/3 of respondents attributed learning disabilities to causes that were inaccurate, so 30-some-odd% of people actually attribute learning disabilities to causes that are not accurate. We also know that 22% of those folks think that LD is caused by too much time spent watching television. That's a myth. The amount of time you spend watching television has no relationship to causing learning disabilities. We know that 31% believe that learning disabilities are caused by poor diet. Again, there is no causal relationship between your diet and whether or not you have a learning disability. We know that 24% believed that learning disabilities are caused by childhood vaccinations. There is very good research out there around LD and vaccinations. We know that learning disabilities are not caused by childhood vaccinations. We also know that more than 1/3 folks think that a lack of early childhood parent-teacher involvement can cause LD. Again, learning disabilities are not caused by this. There's no causal relationship. So these are myths, these kinds of things, and they are very prevalent. So here's your first poll question. Hopefully everyone will participate. I believe that you need to participate if you're getting credit for this. So on the plus side, I don't think you need to be accurate. So participate. What percent of classroom teachers believe that learning and attention issues are sometimes just laziness? Is it 17%, 33%, 56%, or 72%? Again, what percent of classroom teachers believe that learning and attention issues are sometimes just laziness? I'm going to give you a few seconds to respond. Please don't forget to hit submit once you've picked a letter. Okay, let's see the results. So most people seem to believe that the answer is B, 33%, followed closely by C, 56%. Let's see. Beliefs of educators and parents. 33% of classroom teachers and other educators believe sometimes what people call a learning or attention issue is really just laziness. So yeah, it's about 1/3. Good job on the poll. 43% of parents say that they would not want others to know that their child has a learning disability. And 54% of doctors' recommendations are followed by parents who have a child evaluated for learning and attention issues. So just over half of parents actually follow their doctor's recommendations around learning disabilities. Just under half of parents say that they would not want others to know that their child has a learning disability. And a third of classroom teachers and other educators believe that learning and attention issues are sometimes really just laziness. So you can see that these myths are kind of very, very prevalent. The one about parents saying that they would not want others to know is something that's important for teachers to know, right? So parents can be very uncomfortable with having their child identified as having a learning disability. And parents also are not that reliable at following through with recommendations. So those are two things that educators do need to know. Here is another poll. Which of these is not a myth? A, sugar can cause attention problems. B, we only use about 10% of our brains. C, letter reversals are a sign of dyslexia. D, kids with dyslexia cannot read. So one of those is not a myth. The other three are myths. Which one do you think is not a myth? Don't forget to hit submit. Okay. Aha. Which of these is not a myth? So we think that sugar can cause attention problems. 30% of you selected that one. We only use about 10% of our brain. 30% of you selected that one. Letter reversals are a sign of dyslexia. 40% of you chose that as not being a myth. Let's see what the facts are. So these are neuromyths. All of these are actually myths. We also know that belief of one of these is commonly linked to beliefs in the others, and that each myth really just oversimplifies human thinking and behavior. So the reason these are myths is because they are oversimplifications of human thinking and behavior. Using 10% of your brain, that is a myth. We use all of our brain. We don't only use 10%. Learning styles is a myth, and again, it's just an oversimplification. So learning preferences do exist, but learning styles do not. And that's one that a lot of people wrestle with because there was a lot of popular press out there and educational information provided that suggested that different kids have different learning styles. What they actually have is different learning preferences. So if you teach somebody who prefers to have information presented visually, if you teach them with auditory information, they can learn that way. And if you teach somebody who prefers auditory information with visual information, they can learn that way. So it's not a matter of whether they can or cannot learn in those ways. It's really just which they prefer. The left and right-brained is also a myth. All people use both sides of their brain, with the very rare exception of those who have had a hemisphere removed or something like that. But everybody uses both sides of their brain. Dyslexia and letter reversals is one that is pretty common. Dyslexia, letter reversals are not a sign of dyslexia. Letter reversals are a common occurrence throughout childhood development. And then the role of sugar on attention, there's actually no evidence to suggest that ADHD or anything like that is caused by increased amounts of sugar consumption. These neuromyths are remarkably prevalent. So if you believed any of these, you are in the majority. An awful lot of people believe this. We happen to know that there is good research out there to show that they are myths, but these are prevalent myths. Even responders with neuroscience training believe a lot of these myths. Educators believe a lot of these myths, and of course the general public believes even more. So I always find that to be a stunning slide. So many people believe those myths. It just shows you how powerful myths can be and how prevalent they can be. So here now are some facts. We know that students with learning and attention issues are not reaching their academic potential. These are the NAEP scores, and you can see that kids with learning disabilities are not in any way meeting their potential. Another polling question. So which of these is a fact? So that was one fact that I just gave you. Kids with learning disabilities are not meeting their potential in reading or math. Which of these is also a fact? A, half of students identified with specific learning disabilities interact with the criminal justice system within 8 years of graduation. B, students identified with specific learning disability drop out of high school twice as often as other students. C, 25% of students identified with specific learning disabilities drop out of college. Or D, watching too much TV can cause a learning disability. So which of those is a fact? Don't forget to hit submit. Students identified with specific learning disabilities drop out of high school twice as often as other students is what everybody who took the poll thinks is a fact. Students with learning and attention issues can experience ripple effects of negative outcomes. We know that. So the fact that you have a learning disability is a good indicator that you're going to experience some negative outcomes, especially if you don't get the right kind of support. 3 times as many kids with specific learning disabilities drop out of high school as kids without. 41% complete college. 2 times as many are likely to be jobless. And 50% are involved with the criminal justice system within 8 years. So that is always, to me, the most stunning stat, is that about half of kids identified as having a specific learning disability or kids with learning and attention issues interact with the criminal justice system within 8 years of graduating from high school. When we were thinking of creating educator content, which you're going to see here very shortly, we did a lot of research with educators, and the results of that research suggest that general educators feel pretty unprepared to meet the needs of 1 in 5 kids with learning and attention issues in their classes. We know that most kids with learning and attention issues spend the majority of their time in general ed classrooms, but that general ed teachers are not provided the kind of training or resources necessary to meet those students' needs from the perspective of the teachers. So 17% of general educators feel very prepared to teach students with learning and attention issues. 63% though say they are note that they have received some formal or informal training on teaching students with learning disabilities. And you might look at 63% and say, hey, that's pretty good. That's almost 40% of teachers who are reporting that they have not received formal or informal training in working with kids with learning disabilities. And we know that teachers all have kids with learning and attention issues in their classrooms. 70% of elementary school teachers say that they struggle to support students with learning and attention issues, as opposed to only 17% who feel very prepared. General educators are more effective when they use methods that support 1 in 5 kids with learning and attention issues. We know this through research. When teachers are trained and equipped with the right resources to teach students with learning and attention issues, they end up engaging in more purposeful, skill-focused instructional planning, and all students see greater outcomes. So this is a powerful point. So if you are a general education teacher, you can be confident that if you use strategies and instructional practices that have been shown to be effective for kids with learning and attention issues, you will in fact see greater outcomes for all of the students in the class. When general education teachers teach 4th and 5th grade students using a reading strategy that is aligned to best practices in special education, students with and without LD enhance their reading comprehension skills. And there's some of the data behind that for you to take a look at. Another thing we know is that inclusion of the 1 in 5, in other words, inclusion of kids with learning and attention issues in general education classrooms, does not make educators less effective with the 4 and 5. Good research has been conducted in this area because there is a myth out there that says that if a teacher pays too much attention to kids with learning and attention issues, then the other kids suffer. That's not actually what happens. I personally believe it's not what happens because teachers are not that simplistic in the way they approach their jobs, right? We all go into the classroom knowing that we're going to make a difference for each and every kid that we interact with, and so we are careful to do that. So the fact that some of our kids have learning and attention issues does not detract from the care, attention, and instruction we give to the 4 and 5 in the class who do not. In fact, we know from research that the value-added measures for teachers show that they do not change significantly when general ed classrooms have around 13% of their students with disabilities, and that's identified disabilities. We've done a lot of work around educational research and the literature surrounding educational research, and these are 5 practices that we had understood know that if you as general educators in general education classrooms actually use and focus on and make part of your everyday practice in classes, you will have a very positive effect on the 1 in 5 kids with learning and attention issues, as well as the other kids in your class. And we selected these strategies because they can be, actually they're not strategies, they're practices, but we selected these practices because they are very doable in general education classrooms. These are not things that have to be done in special ed, in pull-out, anything like that. These are general ed strategies or practices that are very effective for kids with learning and attention issues. And they are explicit instruction, so directly teaching concepts, all of that sort of stuff that goes with explicit instruction, modeling, practice, and assessment. Then strategy instruction, universal design for learning, flexible grouping, and scaffolding. So though information on those is readily available everywhere for teachers, we would recommend that you start, as you're thinking about kids with learning and attention issues, with these 5 practices. So we know the practices that work for kids with learning and attention issues, just showed you those. We also know that there are common brain activation profiles for kids with learning and attention issues. So I wanted to put these in the presentation just to let you know that neuroscientists across the country are looking very carefully at the brains of kids with and without learning issues. And we are getting the benefit of their work and seeing patterns that emerge for kids with various learning disabilities, attention issues, that sort of stuff. So we are confident now in what we always assumed. We are confident that these are brain-based conditions. They're not things like laziness. So I want to now look at a few of the specific instructional strategies that are consistent with both those general practices that I just showed you and with the brain activation profiles we're getting from the neuroscientists. The first is around reading. This will be about dyslexia. Dyslexia is the most common learning disability. It's also the one that we understand the best and have the most information around strategies and effectiveness of instruction and things like that around. So the first thing you're going to see here is a video of a girl named Jade who struggled with dyslexia, with a reading disability. And she's going to talk to you a little bit about what that was like. I always like to start with kids when I can.
It just doesn't bother you anymore. That's when you get really worried. That's when you should get really worried. When you get this numbing feeling, someone calls you and you're like, I don't care. They're right. That's the worst feeling in the world. The teacher talked to me. They said, we know that you have this disability and we know how to help you. I would go through one line, she's like, okay, stop. And then she said, and then she had on the board, like it was like she already knew I was coming. Each word was separated. And she had this special board with like, little dots. And she was like, what does this sound? What is this letter? I'm like, it's an S. S. And I felt really stupid. But at the end of the day, I could say that sentence. I would just like walk around at the dinner table. I'm reading. I'm everywhere. In the car. I'm sitting down in my roller skates reading a book. I walked into a treat. I had finished a book and I felt awesome. And she reads the book, dancing around in my dad's football jersey. She's completed the championship. I'm serious. And the crowd goes wild. I still have that jersey. I do. And it smells terrible.
So that was Jade. Jade does a great job of describing in the full video the frustration and the social emotional impact that she felt from having dyslexia or reading disability. And then she talks about the teacher who came, who she came to meet and to work with, who really influenced her life in terms of her reading development. And the thing that she says in the video that's so important is the teacher was ready for her. It's like she expected her to be there, right? So the amount of preparation that you put in to understanding kids with dyslexia or with a reading disability can have such a strong impact. If kids feel like you expect them to be part of your class and you're ready for them when they come in, it does really make such a difference for the kids. The full video of Jade explaining this is available on understood.org. I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you have a chance. Dyslexia is a pattern of learning difficulties characterized by problems with accurate and fluent reading of individual words. So dyslexia is a word-level reading challenge, poor decoding, poor spelling, and lack of fluent word recognition. The neuroscience behind it is that there are, in fact, differences when you look at the way kids who read at the single word level very well and kids who really struggle reading at the single word level. We have seen distinct patterns of difficulty now, and it really has to do with the way your neural networks activate kind of in the front of your brain where there's more activation and in the rear where there is less compared to what I'll call typical readers. That's really confirming that the difficulties that kids are having really are at that phonological level, so that this dyslexia is not a visual problem. It is at the level of sounds in words, whether those sounds are presented, or whether those words are presented orally or they're presented in print. Kids with dyslexia have difficulty identifying individual sounds in words, putting sounds together to make words, all of that kind of thing. So what can you do around that? Here's a strategy. Turns out this is not the video. Sorry about that. The video is next. But this is the strategy that we had Understood identified as one of the ones we wanted to start with, because there really is a good evidence base behind this strategy. So if you use this to help kids with dyslexia or with that single word reading at that sound level, you will see good results. This is a solidly evidence-based strategy. It goes well with those 5 practices that I showed you earlier. It's called Elkonin sound boxes, and basically it helps students to identify and then put together sounds in words. So I'm going to show you a video now of a teacher who is doing this, using this strategy. And these are available at Understood for you, both these kind of handouts and descriptions and then the videos as well.
My name is Lisa McDermott, and I teach first grade. It's important for students to segment individual sounds within words. They need to understand that all letters have sounds that build words. If they can hear those sounds and pull those sounds together, they're going to be able to transition into reading. I use Elkonin sound boxes to help the children hear sounds that put words together. So each time that they're making a sound, they're pulling that sound into the box and trying to form each sound together to create a full word. So today we're going to work on a new activity. We're going to be listening to a word, and we're going to be separating the sounds to a word. And then we're going to put the sounds together and make that word. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. For each sound, so for instance, the word it, this is the first sound, I. I'm going to bring down 1. The next sound, t, I'm bringing down. All right, so each box represents one sound. And then we're going to pull the sounds together. So we're going to do that for a bunch of different words, all right? I'd like you to say this word, hit.
Hit.
Okay. Now, I'd like you to take some squares and put them on your mat for me, please. Let's do this together. You ready? We're going to put a finger on our block. Good. Now let's pull those sounds down. Ready? Begin. It. Hit. Nice job.
Okay, so that gives you an idea of the kind of videos that exist on Understood to help you with these strategies that I'm going to show you. We don't have time this evening for me to show you the whole kind of 5-minute video, but all of the Educator content has focuses on an evidence-based instructional strategy and gives you a detailed explanation of it sort of in word form, and then also has a video of a teacher actually implementing it with a couple kids or with a class in some cases. So we hope you will check that out. I'm going to give you an example of math now. So when we talk about math, the disability that we discuss is dyscalculia, and that includes difficulties characterized by problems processing numerical information, learning arithmetic facts, and performing accurate or fluent calculations, it should say. So this involves mathematics. And the cognitive neuroscience signature is pretty clear with this one as well. We know that there's reduced activation in the area of the brain, the IPS, which is actually the intraparietal sulcus. And in that area of the brain, which controls spatial memory, visual attention, symbolic, numerical abilities, and also your ability to interpret the intent of other people, we know that there is lower activation there than in kids without math issues, without dyscalculia. So when the slide says DD, it means developmental dyscalculia, which is the actual condition. And there are some other descriptions there in the brain. But again, we are just linking kind of our understanding of what goes on with kids who have specific math disabilities and what we can actually now see in the way that their neural networks activate and do not activate within their brains compared to people without developmental dyscalculia. And so we can kind of tie that to strategies that we use. And so one of the things that we've known for a while is that the number line is so important for developing mathematical concepts. In fact, and this is a fun fact if you don't know it, the one thing that best predicts students' later success in math classes is their ability to manipulate number lines. So their ability to actually use a number line effectively as a tool is the best predictor of whether or not somebody will be successful in later, more advanced mathematics in school. So if you don't do anything else with your students and you're responsible for teaching them math, make sure that they really understand how to use a number line, introduce it as often as you can, use it as frequently as you can, and help your kids get really good at it. This is a strategy for how you can teach fractions, and it involves using a small number line to teach fractions. There is a corresponding video like the one you saw for reading. I'll play just a little bit of it.
My name is Betsy Flanagan, and I teach 4th grade.
So fractions are typically introduced around 3rd grade and teaching 4th grade. Fractions, when we start that fraction unit, kids are often really nervous. One of the common struggles that kids come across is that they're so used to dealing with whole numbers, 1 through 100, and they know that the higher the number, the more the quantity or the bigger the piece. And when they're faced with fractions where they're thinking about denominators and parts of a whole, and that it becomes a total opposite way of thinking. The higher the number, now the smaller the piece. In order for them to understand that, they need to actually physically work with fractions. They can't just visualize it, most of them. They need that tool, and a number line allows them to see a whole and be able to break it into pieces. Well, today we're going to talk about fractions, and we're going to use a model called a number line. How many of you have used a number line before? Yeah, you've all used a number line for lots of different things. Have you used a number line to compare fractions before?
A little bit.
Yeah, a little bit, right? So we're going to do some problem solving, and we're going to look at the number lines on your sheets here, and we're going to try to solve some problems together. Who here plays soccer? Couple soccer players. Have you ever played another sport on a field?
Yes, I played football.
Okay, so we're going to think about a soccer field, and we're going to talk about 2 students. Their names are Jacob and Amy, and we're going to talk about how far down the soccer field they raced and who got farther. So if they're both starting at one end of a soccer field, they're going to race down, and I'm going to tell you how far they got, and then we're going to figure out who got farther, okay? So we're going to use a number line because number lines can help us. They're a tool that can help us solve problems. So this is my number line here, and my number line starts at 0 and ends at 1. Really important to always look at where it begins and where it ends, because it doesn't always start at 0 and it doesn't always end at 1. Sometimes it is just a chunk of the number line. So if this is our field, now we're going to picture our soccer field from here to here. And if Jacob starts at the beginning, and
so in the interest of time, I'm just going to stop that. But you can see her explaining the number line. Then the kids will practice with it. And all of the teachers here are demonstrating, good models of explicit instruction. She was helping the kids relate to it a little by making that soccer analogy. She knows her kids well. She knew all of them had played soccer. So that's a good connection to make. And those go back to those 5 practices that we suggested on the one slide. So with the Elkonin boxes for the word level reading, now with the number line for math and fractions, these are solidly evidence-based strategies that you can use. For writing, the difficulties often correspond to other learning and attention issues. So dyslexia can involve difficulty with spelling, with some forms of writing. ADHD can make writing very difficult, and so can many of the other conditions. So writing difficulties overlap often with executive function issues, fine motor, reading difficulties, that sort of stuff. This is the definition of a specific learning disorder in writing from the manual that psychologists and other clinicians use to diagnose disorders. And then we know that there is a good neuroscience signature here too. I'm not going to spend any time on this one because I want to get to the actual strategy, which really is graphic organizers. Hopefully graphic organizers are something that everybody is familiar with, but there is a very solid evidence base around the positive impact that graphic organizers can have for kids with learning and attention issues in the area of writing. Remember, however, that there are as many kinds of different graphic organizers as there are types of writing, and they can range from making persuasive arguments to mapping out an engaging story and everything else that is included with writing. It's important to look for a graphic organizer that matches your child's writing assignment. So don't just pick any organizer. Make sure that you're picking the one that is good for the type of writing that your child is going to be doing. This is a graphic organizer for paragraphs. Kids like the burger shape and all that sort of stuff. So this is one that exists out there and you can access on Understood. Then for pros and cons, we have kind of that T-chart there that works very well. And then for sequencing, there's a graphic organizer that works well, and you can see that as the writing gets a little more difficult, the graphic organizer gets a little more complicated, and that's to be expected. but graphic organizers have a solid evidence base behind them in terms of positive impact on the writing development of kids with learning and attention issues. And then we have attention, impulsivity, and organization. I know when I was a classroom teacher, the kids with the impulsivity and attention and organization problems were a particular challenge. We included an evidence-based practice around attention in our initial batch of content on Understood for Educators. This is the definition of ADHD from that same manual that clinicians use. It has the different parts of it listed there. There is a distinct signature compared to control studies around kids who have ADHD, kids who do not. And this is the strategy that we are recommending. It's called the SLANT strategy. Each letter in the word SLANT stands for a behavior that the kids should do, kind of, sit up, lean towards, that sort of stuff. Track the speaker with your eyes. The SLANT strategy is evidence-based. It has a good research base behind it in terms of getting kids to pay attention. This is one where cultural sensitivity is important because there are many cultures of kids that we teach where, making direct eye contact with the adults and kind of staring at them as they speak is considered rude. So a couple of the teachers that we've worked with have suggested that, talking to kids directly about that and saying that this is a way for you, the student, to help me, the teacher, know that you are paying attention. So it's a way that you can help me, that sort of stuff, to make it clear why you want them to do that. You can also alter the strategy based on kids' cultural needs. So that's something kind of to keep in mind when looking at a strategy like SLANT. This is a video, again, of the teacher using the SLANT strategy. We don't really have time to go over it. This is the URL right here under u.org/u4educators. So if you want the educator content in particular, you can use that URL. If you want all of the thousands of pieces of content and tips and tools and stuff that are kind of geared for parents but very useful for teachers, you can use understood.org. But I would love for you to go and check out u.org/u4educators. Look at some of our content, give us feedback on this content. Our goal, again, is to provide some research-based, kind of evidence-based practices that you can use the next time you are teaching these kinds of things with the kids that you work with. So hopefully that was helpful. I promised Tamika that I would leave time at the end here for questions. It looks like we have 5 or so minutes for questions, so hopefully folks have some.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob, for such a great presentation. I'd like to ask everyone who has questions to go to the Q&A widget and type in your questions. Also, you should now be able to download your professional development certificate if you answered the poll questions in this webinar. It's best to do that now before you log out of the session. You must be on a laptop or a desktop to access this certificate. All right, so for our first question, it's from Patricia. Why isn't dyslexia considered a learning disability in all states? And is there any way to change this?
Yeah, so there are great advocacy organizations out there working to change this. Under the Obama administration, the Federal Department of Education issued guidance to all states telling them that dyslexia should be recognized as a learning disability. It is, in fact, in the federal law. So it is recognized in the federal law as a specific learning disability. But organizations like the National Center for Learning Disabilities, the Learning Disabilities Association of America, those groups are advocating very strongly for states to include that. Many, many states do. There are a couple who do not formally do that. But again, the position of the Department of Education is that dyslexia is something that you can talk about and that is recognized.
Awesome. So our next question is from Jody Brown. She'd like to know, how does Elkonin, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, help students that have strong word attack and can sound out words accurately? Doesn't that slow them down and not help them with the fluency piece?
Well, hopefully you're differentiating in your class so that kids who are able to kind of do that sort of readily are moving on. Other kids are practicing it more, right? So one of the practices you'll notice on that slide with the 5 effective practices is flexible grouping. So we would strongly encourage teachers to use flexible grouping practices just for that very reason, so that kids can have extended practice when they need it, kind of in those areas. So that would be sort of my suggestion around that. It's also something that that should be taught to every kid until they demonstrate to you that they're very facile with that. So I'll say that as well, that some teachers assume that because a kid has strong oral language, they are good at that sort of activity, and a lot of kids with dyslexia, with difficulty at that word level, have very strong oral language but have a lot of difficulty with those kind of exercises. So make sure, but use flexible grouping to allow kids who are facile with that to try different strategies to help develop their reading.
Okay. Our next question is from Jody. Patricia. I have special ed students, and we use Elkonin boxes. So I think in a self-contained class, we could also. Do you do small groups? This is how I use them.
So yeah, no, I think if you are a teacher in a self-contained class and all of the kids you're working with have difficulty at that word level and with things like segmentation and blending, obviously, yeah, use the whole group instruction there works very well. But if you're kind of in a general ed classroom where kids are at different skill levels in those areas, the flexible grouping is what I'd recommend in order to allow you to differentiate. Whereas maybe for your kids, Patricia, you don't have to differentiate on this particular skill. I would still encourage you very strongly to use flexible grouping as a practice so that you can have kids working on different strategies at the same time so that you're able to meet the needs. Because even in a self-contained special education classroom, your kids are going to have differences kind of in their learning and in their skill acquisition. So I would still encourage you to use flexible grouping.
Great. We have 2 more questions. The next is from Kim Green, and she'd like to know, is the content free?
The content is free. Everything on Understood and the Understood for Educators is entirely free. On the understood.org, the content for parents is entirely available in both English and Spanish as well, but it's always free.
Okay. And Tamara would like to know what you can tell us about working particularly with English language learners.
So one of the commitments that we've made as a team who is looking at developing content for educators is not to do the same thing that we criticize other fields for doing. So a lot of the times folks do things curriculum-wise, instruction-wise, and then they sort of add on kids with learning issues after it's all been done. So as we are creating our content, we are particularly sensitive to the needs of English learners because we want to include them from the beginning and not add them on after we've already decided on content in the project. So the strategies that we are recommending, the instructional practices that we recommended, those 5, and the individual strategies that we went over, all have a strong evidence base for English learners as well as kids with learning and attention issues. We want you to pick these because we know that they will be effective for the most kids possible.
Great. And we have one more question, which will be our last question for the evening. On the slide about the 5 practice, can you talk about the difference between explicit instruction and strategy instruction?
Yes. So explicit instruction refers to that process that I described earlier where there is teacher modeling, then there is kind of practice together, and then there is individual practice, right? So it's I as a teacher do this, we as a group do this, you as an individual do this, right? That's always the sequence for individual instruction, and it involves sort of explicitly teaching the concepts, that sort of stuff. Cognitive strategy instruction or strategy instruction there refers to a kind of related but different process around developing those sort of executive functions and academic content knowledge. So the work on cognitive strategy instruction comes out of the University of Kansas, KU, and if you look up Don Deschler, D-E-S-H-L-E-R, he is the professor who did the most work kind of in that area. And Kansas's stuff is great around strategy instruction. So those are different. Strategy instruction involves specifically breaking complex processes down into component parts and working with kids that way. Explicit instruction is that I do, we do, you do kind of process. So that's how they are different. So I think that was our last question.
Thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful.
Absolutely. Let me say thank you to everyone.
Absolutely. And thanks again. All right. And thank you to our participants for joining us for this webinar. 2 more items for our attendees. We appreciate your feedback, and we have 2 easy ways. 1, to connect with us. 1, please take the survey that will show up on your screen momentarily. This feedback is valuable to our speakers and to us as we plan future webinars. Visit the registration page for this session on Share My Lesson and add your own rating and review to help others.